Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Dan Moreno. I'm the Senior Annual Events Coordinator at SID-United States. Please take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat. You can include your name, your organization if you have one, and where you're calling in from. So today's event is Demystifying International Development Banks. This event is in partnership with JESCA Solutions. Before we get started, I just wanted to share that the views and opinions expressed by speakers in this event are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or positions of SID-US or their respective employers, and we do not endorse any specific perspectives, strategies, or advice shared during today's session. Some things to note for today's session is that this session is recorded and will be shared publicly. Closed captioning can be accessed through your individual Zoom settings. And please post your questions for the speakers in the Q&A box. We'll keep the chat box for conversations and introductions, but any questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A box. If you have any trouble finding that, let us know in the chat. And you can also upvote somebody else's question. So if somebody else had a question that you also had, you can upvote that to let the speakers know that you also had a question. And unfortunately, due to limited time today, we may not get to every question. I wanted to share a couple upcoming SID-US events with you all. So on September 16, we have Scaling Resilience in Ethiopia. On September 18, we have a Ukraine Affinity Group meeting. On October 8th, we have an event on mapping and activating your professional network. So with that, I'm going to introduce Rudolph from JESCA Solutions, who will have a brief presentation, and then it will be over to Danica Starks and Hiro Rodriguez, speaking from the World Bank and the U.S. Department of Commerce. So Rudolph, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Dan. I am just dealing with an issue with my presentation, so I'll address this shortly. Dan, can you please load up my presentation if you have it, because I cannot access mine from that point. Dan, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I'm pulling up your presentation.
Thank you.
No problem.
Yes, good morning, everybody. Thank you for giving us your time this morning, and sorry for the delay. I'm Rudolph Saint-Jean. I'm the CEO and co-founder of JESCA Solutions, a small firm in the DC area involved in international development. My background is in technology and international development, and I've been involved in the field for about 20 years. JESCA Solutions is a small firm that does a lot of international development work in urban and planning and development, in environmental and sustainability impact, and in economic development. We recently, as a whole industry, face a very difficult situation when USAID was disbanded by the current administration. And this unfortunate incident affected, unfortunately, the whole industry and created a very difficult situation for not only the people on the ground who were recipient of sometime life saving help, but also this affected tremendously the ecosystem of suppliers and that depended on this work, and affected people's life, affected careers, and affected the industry itself. And in search for a solution, I recently attended in early May an event put together by the U.S. Department of Commerce, the World Bank, and the government of Maryland and Virginia to see what solutions that could be offered for this situation, to fill the gap that was created by the absence of these providers. And what we have learned during this time, during this meeting, was that the World Bank as an organization have been looking for providers like the providers that work with USAID. The World Bank as an organization have been is working in the same field, the same areas, in the same sectors that USAID and other uh, international development providers, donors work. And they are looking to work with providers that were involved with USAID. And the barrier that they usually face were US firms were not interested in working with the World Bank for many reasons. Among them, they are they do not understand the procurement system as they see it as complex and price driven mostly. They fear that the contract that they sign with foreign government, as is to work with the World Bank, might be less safe than the contract that they typically have with the US government, with USAID particularly. And in response to that, the World Bank have been taking several steps to address these issues, these fears, and present a procurement system that is more balanced and more advantageous to these US providers who are used to work with USAID. Next slide, please. We believe that there's a great match between the World Bank needs and the US providers, the implementers that used to work with the World Bank. Mainly technical expertise. These organizations have strong technical expertise in many of the sectors, if not all of the sectors that the US that the World Bank is currently working, and they also have similar geographical coverage for having worked all across Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, particularly Latin America and Southeast Asia, where a lot of these organizations have worked. And they definitely have the proven track record for having worked for one of the most stringent and demanding donors in the field. On the other hand, next slide, please. The next slide, please. So we believe that more organizations should engage with the World Bank. Should They should learn the procurement processes that the World Bank uses. They should explore this source of funding for the critical services that they provide, and this is in order to continue to advance the development goals that we all share and we all hold very dear. Next slide, please. So this webinar, we believe, is the beginning of an ongoing series of meetings, webinar, workshop, and guidances, hopefully in-person meeting as well, so that we can learn and understand the processes of the World Bank that the World Bank uses to acquire services and to engage with providers, with suppliers. Okay, we have here an experienced team from the U.S. Department of Commerce and that sits at the World Bank, who will talk to us about how to demystify the process of working with the World Bank. We have Hero Rodriguez, who is the executive director of the Advocacy Center for the U.S. Department of Commerce, and we have Danica Starks, who is the senior U.S. commercial liaison at the World Bank, among other titles. Our vision is to ensure that experienced implementers that have strong background in international development and that currently have very light foot in terms of work can engage with the World Bank and see their portfolio of needs and continue to contribute to a global development success. We are now going to engage in a small survey where we're going to ask you a few questions about what you would like to see either in these sessions or in the upcoming sessions that we plan that we are planning, that we have in the work. So let's continue this conversation, and after the questions, Danica Stark, Hero Rodriguez will start the presentation on the work that the U.S. Department of Commerce is doing with the World Bank to help U.S. firms engage with the World Bank, and then Danica Stark will elaborate more on that. Thank you. Danica.
Dan, can you let me know if you're ready for me to share my screen?
I think you can go ahead and share. I think we'll give the poll maybe another 30 seconds and then
Okay.
thank you.
Great. Good morning. I hope everyone can hear me. My name is Danica Starks, and I work for the U.S. Department of Commerce as the Senior U.S. Commercial Liaison to the World Bank. And I physically sit at the World Bank. Hiro Rodriguez is my boss's boss. He is the Executive Director of the U.S. Advocacy Center and appointee with the current administration. He is coming back from an event, so he will join probably midway through my talk. So I'll introduce him when he comes, but he just wanted to greet and give remarks welcoming U.S. companies. So thank you for joining. I'm going to be talking about taking a step back and actually talk about demystifying working with the multilateral development banks in general. And then we will actually consider doing a session specifically about the World Bank. So I'm not necessarily going to talk about the World Bank specifically today, but rather take a step back and talk about the multilateral development banks in general and talk about how the U.S. Department of Commerce can help you in working in this space. And I'm going to share my screen. Great. So I hope everyone can see. So a little bit first, again, I work for the U.S. Department of Commerce and the International Trade Administration. In addition to the fact that I'm the senior commercial liaison at the World Bank, I also supervise our liaison teams at the other multilateral development banks. And what we want to do is do a presentation to really take a step back. We've gotten a lot of meetings with companies that previously did work with USAID and also just looking to expand writ large given the change in nature of the development landscape. And what I realized is that while a lot of people know of the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank or others, most people actually don't know how these banks work. And so many times they're coming to us with business strategies and with questions that really are not a fit for how the banks work and have had to sort of rethink. And once they have rethought, then they've actually understood the opportunity. So what I'm going to do today is something unique and a little bit different than what I've ever done in the past. And so I beg your pardon, my slides are probably not the world's best PowerPoints that you've ever seen. For those of you who are millennials and older, you remember the Power Rangers. I am not a PowerPoint Ranger. And this, in many cases, is the first time that I think we have really kind of laid out the case for the MDBs and developing a strategy for the MDBs sort of in this sort of format. And then what we are looking to do with my team is to possibly do a 101 series that goes through each of the MDBs for more information. But I want to actually really talk about just sort of getting companies head in the game about working with the banks. I don't want to under or over assume knowledge. So for those of you who are whizzes and experts on the MDBs, hopefully this won't be too basic for you. But like I said, I believe that there's a lot of people who really have trouble understanding how these banks work. Sort of bottom line up front, here's what I hope we get out of this session. One, for those of you who are not familiar with the International Trade Administration, many of you might have worked with USAID or others, but many of you might have not actually worked with the International Trade Administration to understand who we are and what we can do to help businesses grow. To understand that the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, do represent an untapped, I would say, medium to long-term opportunity. This is not a short-term opportunity. And so I want to be very clear about that, but a medium to long-term opportunity for some development companies. And that working with the multilateral development banks does require a dedication of resources and time and effort different from other institutions. So this really is a pivot. I understand that pivots are hard, but we want to demonstrate that we're here for you. And we are here to help you try to work through the pivot and to try to find other ways that you can continue to have the positive impact on the world that I know your organizations have. And also just to note that continued engagement and work with the MDBs, even if you decide that you're not going to try to be a service provider or a business provider to them, that there is value in working with the MDBs just because of the role that they play in the development space. So first, a little bit about the International Trade Administration. We are headquartered in Washington, D.C. in the Herbert C. Hoover Building, but we have offices all over the United States and all over the world. We have people in most of the commercial capitals around the United States. We have offices called U.S. Export Assistance Centers, and we also have trade and commercial attaché teams in many countries around the world. Unfortunately, a lot of the low and middle income countries and the development countries where the multilateral development banks exist are not where we have our strongest presence. But in the cases where we don't have an office, we often have a partnership post agreement with the economic section of the U.S. Embassy working with the State Department. So our mission is to create prosperity by strengthening international competitiveness of U.S. companies and their workers. So we promote trade and investment, ensure fair trade compliance with trade laws and agreements, and basically help promote U.S. business overseas. So ITA does this through several things. We promote U.S. exports. We attract inbound investment. So we have a program called Select USA that works to bring foreign investment and jobs here in the United States. We do industry competitiveness, looking at how to promote and strengthen U.S. critical technologies. We defend against unfair trade. So within the International Trade Administration, we have people that are working on trade remedies, countervailing duties, anti-dumping. And we have more than 2,000 employees. We do about 174 billion US dollars in exports, and we have a $230 return on investment. Basically, for every $1 that is appropriated to us, we return $230. We work with firms of all sizes. So we work with small and medium-sized enterprises. We work with large companies. We work with foreign investors, with U.S. industry and policymakers. So we're happy to talk to you both about promoting specific business opportunities, but also to promoting certain policies that will assist with market access overseas. So that's a little bit about the International Trade Administration. Towards the back half, at the back end of the presentation, I will talk specifically about some tools that we have for helping U.S. companies that are going to be working with the multilateral development banks. So let's get into the meat of it in terms of working with the MDBs and the international financial institution landscape. So we're going to talk just a little bit about who the players are, what the differences are, what the MDBs do, why you should care. And I put a nota bene here. What follows, again, first of all, this is our first time really kind of presenting this in this way. So I really would appreciate your feedback, positive and negative. I can take it all. We really are searching for ways to take some very complex things and narrow them down in a way that is more easily understood and absorbed. But we are happy to do webinars and trainings that are much more in-depth and detailed on specific banks. We can also get the banks to do in-depth training on specific issues. For example, the World Bank is going to have a global training on procurement for their public sector financing. So there are opportunities for deep dives. This is really a deep dive more into the MDBs, what they are, and MDB strategy. Because of that, there are going to be a lot of oversimplifications and generalizations. So please don't take this as gospel. I said you have officially been warned. So in the chat, there's going to be exceptions to every rule. There's going to be one bank that maybe doesn't do this as well. These are generalizations, so I'm aware of that. So if you know of an example where something that I'm characterizing doesn't work, I totally understand that. This is just a general way to sort of just to look at things, but there will be exceptions to every rule, and so just please keep that in mind as we go along. So just some of the myriad groups that we're talking about. We talk about development and international financial institutions. And so before we talk about MDBs fit into this broader group. And so what are the differences? What does it mean? And so these are just some of the names that I'm sure many of you all are familiar with. So first of all, we've got bilateral assistance agencies such as USAID, such as GIZ, such as JICA. These are organizations, as you all know, that get their money budgeted directly from a government to do assistance and technical assistance and projects and programs overseas. What's different about these is one of their bilateral. So it's usually one country's foreign policy interests or commercial interests They're budgeted money, and so this is not money that is dependent on shareholders and other things. It's budgeted money. The government's deciding it wants to put $50 million into a certain program. It budgets the money and out it goes. These are also, again, done really with the foreign policy priorities of a specific country in mind. Bilateral development banks. So individual countries also may have development banks. So Germany is a perfect example where they have GIZ, which is their development agency, but they also have a development bank, a German development bank that goes in and co-finances projects, more specifically, and operates more on a commercial banking side for a lot of bigger infrastructure and other projects. So you have bilateral development banks. Foundations and funds, you have the Gates Foundation, you have the Clinton Global Initiative, all kinds of foundations and funds which basically gather money for certain specific causes, certain specific sectors, and they tend to not necessarily be implementers, but they tend to be sources of funding, and they work with implementers such as the World Bank to get things done in certain sectors. So the Gates Foundation, others will often partner with the World Bank by giving World Bank money in order to implement programs for them on the ground in a certain area. United Nations agencies, that's a whole myriad. So you have all of the United Nations agencies, UN Development Program, UNESCO, UNICEF. The United Nations is a very different model. And I see Hiro has joined us, so I'll stop after I finish this slide and let him Hiro. But you have United Nations agencies, which are very fully funded and do a lot of their procurement directly. They have the most coverage of anybody in the world. They go into places that nobody can go. You have commercial banks, so think Citibank and others, HSBC, that do banking around the world. The International Monetary Fund, which really is focused on budget support and technical assistance and macroeconomic work with countries. And then the multilateral development banks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can have Hiro come and talk, and then I will pick up and talk more about multilateral development banks. Hiro, thank you for joining us. I know you're on the road.
Yes, Danica. Well, thank you so much, and everyone. I apologize for being late, but thank you. I really appreciate this initiative and Danica's leadership. Always sort of thinking ahead of what we could be doing to help so many folks that are in our ecosystem. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Hiro Rodriguez. So I run the Advocacy Center, and I've been doing this since April 28th. I'll tell you, in a previous life, I spent most of my career in the private sector. And I've been in that position where I was trying to figure out how to navigate the U.S. government in terms of how they can help, whether it was going overseas and trying to figure out that who can I call, or even here in D.C., when we were scaling up DocuSign before we were getting ready to take that public back in the day. I didn't know that I could call on the Commerce Department or call someone at an MDB that actually has American interests at their heart. And so, I really appreciate that we have liaisons and leadership like Danica that are really making a difference on that. For the Advocacy Center, we're part of the Department of Commerce's ITA, the International Trade Administration, specifically within global markets. And we are the crew that really helps you win deals and competitive bids, whether it's within the MDB or just generally speaking within foreign governments. That's really simple what we do. We help the U.S. government, U.S. companies win these foreign government procurement jobs. And so I also just want to say how we do it is really putting the entire weight of the USG, whether it's ambassadors or cabinet level officials. This afternoon, I got to go have one of the weekly visits and get Secretary Letnick to sign a letter on behalf of an American company that's bidding on a deal in Europe. And what makes this one fun is that I'm personally going to go overseas and hand deliver it. One of the things I really like about having our MDB liaisons across the World Bank and Africa Development Bank, had this call with Asia Development Bank, is that they are sitting at the bank and can represent American interests at a time where our competitors are very heavy into the bank to ensure that their countries are winning bids. And so our MDB staff, they really are the eyes and the ears in terms of on the ground and the way that they can assist you. And additionally, how they can have a conversation to help drive policy that is making it so that it's fair for U.S. companies like yourselves. I think, I saw the other day, I think the World Bank finances, billions of dollars every single year, but yet U.S. firms win, less than 1% of these contracts. That's an imbalance that we need to fix, despite the fact that when we do bid, we bid and we win 70% of the time. And so what my encouragement to you all is, as you think about what's next for your business, don't be afraid. Please reach out to Danica, myself, the other MDBs, to allow us to help you to win those bids. It really is important. I think right now more than ever, the administration has made it a point to say we are in the business of helping U.S. companies win deals. And so everyone is sort of rowing in that same direction. So I'll wrap by saying just thank you again for being on this. And again, thank you, Danica. So for all of you, please, Danica is, I call her a strategic offensive weapon here at the Department of Commerce. She really helps us think about strategically how we can be of assistance to many of you. So thank you. Oh, Danica, you're on mute.
That had to happen at least once.
Has to.
Without somebody, talking and their mouth is moving and they're not, and you can't hear it. So I'm glad it happened already. Thank you so much, Hero. I know you are on the road and, now getting back in the car, but we really appreciate it. Wanted people to know that the administration really is, working to support U.S. companies during this whole transition time. But we believe that you all are highly competitive and that there's a lot out there and we want to get you in it. So thank you very much, Hero. We really appreciate it. And thank you for fitting this in. I know you got a lot going on. All right. Thank you. All right. I'm going to reshare my screen. Okay. I think I am back. Okay, great. Thank you. I want, and we'll talk a little bit more about that advocacy process. And I also wanted to clarify, that 1% of value that U.S. companies win, that's on the public sector projects. U.S. companies win more than 1% of projects. It's just that a lot of the high value projects, such as civil works and whatnot, are not areas where we get a lot of U.S. companies bidding, and we're trying to correct for that. But when it comes for the World Bank, for example, when it comes to corporate procurement, and we'll talk about that a little bit during our presentation, U.S. companies win 52%. So let that be a teaser for you to hang in there with me. I'm looking forward to all of your questions. So multilateral development banks is where we ended off. So we have all these different types of international financial institutions. Most of you have dealt with some or all of these. So I know many of you all have been in this. You know this stuff better than I do. But I do want to talk a little bit specifically about what the MDBs are. These are organizations that are literally multilateral in terms of they are countries, are stakeholders, as opposed to private sector. And there are donor and borrowing countries that provide financing and advice, support for economic development and economic advancement. And they finance billions of dollars worth of development projects around the world. Why are the MDBs important and why, and we'll talk a little bit more about why they should be important to you. One, billions of dollars in procurement and financing. Of the banks that the U.S. is a shareholder in, and we'll talk about that in a second, there's over $100 billion a year that is being spent that we want U.S. companies to get a part of. And also not just to get a part of, but we believe that U.S. companies offer some of the best services and innovations that are actually going to be what changes the world. And at the end of the day, that's what this is about, right? Yes, there is a commercial aspect, but most of you got into development not for the money, but because you actually had specific things in the world that you wanted to see done. And we believe that U.S. companies, among others, but we're allowed to be pro-American. I work with the U.S. government, so I can be pro-American. That U.S. companies particularly have a lot to offer. However, we work a lot with allies. And I actually meet with, on a daily basis, colleagues from around the world on the board. We work together, the Italians, the Germans. I just met with my colleague from Ghana. And so we want actually to see U.S. companies to actually partner with companies and organizations around the world. So, but my job specifically is to help U.S. companies. Government procurement writ large is estimated to be about 20 to 30% of GDP, of global GDP, meaning, about a fifth, at least, maybe even up to a third of all the money spent in the global economy is government spending money. And so at the end of the day, if your business model does not include tapping into government procurement, you are missing out on a good chunk of the global economy. And so while government procurement can be difficult, government procurement is actually where a lot of the big ticket money is coming in. And so, and in the low and middle income countries, much of that money is being financed by the multilateral development banks and according to their procurement rules. And so that is a big reason to really consider working with them. These MDBs are global leaders in research and development and on transition, economic transition, best practices. So they're doing a lot of the cutting edge work that governments are listening to and following their advice. We've had a case where the Nigerians wouldn't move forward on a procurement until a certain World Bank report came out because they wanted to see what the latest findings were on how they should develop a specific sector. The MDBs are some of the key implementers of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So again, if you're interested in actually promoting these Sustainable Development Goals, these are the organizations that are doing it. And this is where the majority of the money is flowing through. These banks are leaders in private capital mobilization in low and middle income countries. So they are key for de-risking investment money that is coming in to the countries. And very importantly, and I think this is a lot of what people miss, is going back to their leadership and research. They are giving policy advice, and because of their perceived neutrality, and I say perceived because I mean nobody's exactly neutral, but because they're multilateral, there is a sense of a groupthink coming together. They are go-to advisors for world governments, and so governments listen to them, and also they come with money. And so they're very often places where bilaterally the US might not be listened to on a certain policy topic, but the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank will be. And so these are important leaders in terms of working with foreign governments. So I put this, that the MDBs are the opposite of the Holy Roman Empire. For those of you who took European history, they used to say that the main characteristic of the Holy Roman Empire was that it wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, and it wasn't an empire. Well, it's the opposite with the MDBs. They are multilateral, they are development, and they are banks. And I know that seems very, very obvious, but you would not believe how many people come to me who really haven't thought through that part. So what do I mean by emphasizing that they are literally multilateral development banks? First of all, they're multilateral. These are banks that are run by multiple countries and by boards that represent all of the members. And these members include borrowers and non-borrowers. So every decision that is made by these banks, every project that is approved has to be approved by the board, which is borrowing and non-borrowing countries. So one of the main differences between an MDB and say like a USAID or a GIZ is you do not have one decision maker who can just say, yes, today I want to go do a project on X. And all they got to do is decide whether they can finance it. In the case of these banks, everything that they spend money on has to go through the approval of a board of countries, all of whom have different interests altogether. But the banks themselves are foreign policy neutral. They generally follow the UN when it comes to things like sanctions and other things, but they are foreign policy neutral. And so the banks do not represent the foreign policy of any one country. So even decisions, for example, it was the World Bank and the EBRD voted to not do any more borrowing for Russia, for example, in the wake of the Ukraine invasion. That still had to be voted on by the entire board, which means that, Russia got a vote. It's just that they were voted down. But this basically is part of the nature of working with these banks. Also, development. Whoops, I think that, okay, I lost my screen for a second. Are you all still seeing the share?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So it must be just me. Okay, let's see it. There we go. All right. So their development. So, and again, you all are probably rolling your eyes going, yeah, Danica, we get that. But I can't tell you how many people come into my office wanting to know if they can get funding for their investment project in Germany. These are development banks, so they are only operating in developing countries. They might have an office in the US, like the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank are headquartered here, but they are not doing work here. They are only doing work for and in developing countries. So anything that you want to do with them really needs to be done in a developing country. So again, it sounds obvious, but I can't tell you how many people come in looking for things to be financed here in the US. It has to be the beneficiary, and the location needs to be in a developing country. And we'll talk a little bit more about geography. The sectors of operation are based on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we'll talk about sectors, but again, it's this development as opposed to other, not just commercial lending for anything. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means for sectors. And they're looking at transformational and transformative projects versus transactional. So these banks are looking for, scaled solutions. So they are not going to want to go in and do a health project to do tuberculosis shots, say in one school in Kenya. They're going to want to do a project that looks at tuberculosis prevention in the entire school system of, say, an entire region of Kenya or in all of Kenya. So you need to think about scale when working with these banks. And then lastly, they are banks. These are banks, and so they are focused on lending. There are some grants, and there has been pressure for them to do more in terms of grants because of the debt trap. But for the most part, these banks are lending money. This is not assistance. And because of that, it means the borrowers have a lot of say in what they do and don't want to do. It's why the borrowers do most of the procurement, even though it's under bank rules. So these are banks. This is not assistance. This is not money that is getting given away. Because they're banks, they leverage capital markets. Meaning that they are not trying to wholesale, even when they come in on private investment. They are not trying to do it wholesale. They are trying to de-risk and be part of it. But they're not going to want to take more than about 10 to 30% of any particular project. They have shareholder considerations, and so again, there's a board that consists of multiple countries, and so any project or anything that's presented to them has to be something that's palatable to a global audience, or at least the majority of that global audience in terms of voting. And then they have to look at risk management factors. Now, we can have a whole discussion on the fact that because they're banks, they're looking at risk, and so therefore there are a lot of things that they can't do because of risk or won't do. That's a whole other debate. And I teach a course on economic statecraft, and we talked about that a little bit last night in my class. But because of that risk management factor, these are not going to necessarily be involved in places and have high conflict, for example, of high government instability. They are just not designed to work like that. They're not, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of their characteristics. So what the MDBs, what do they do roughly? And then we'll talk a little bit more about what that means for you. So I divided it into three big overgeneralized categories, because there's even more that they do, and some of them. But in general, most multilateral development banks do public sector work, private sector facing, and knowledge. So for public sector, the banks finance development projects for foreign governments. Most of the money for these banks is going to a foreign government. It is not going to a private entity, except for one bank. So they have financing options such as loans and grants to sovereign and subnational governments. So for example, a lot of bigger countries like India or Brazil, it might be a state or a region that is borrowing. They provide technical assistance and advisory services, and they do support for project preparation activities. One of the reasons that countries want to borrow from, say, the World Bank or the ADB versus a commercial bank is a commercial bank expects you to have all the project preparation done when you come to them for a loan. So, if the government of Tajikistan was looking at doing the Rogun Dam, they couldn't get commercial lending for it because you need to have everything in order. One of the things that these development banks do is, as part of the contribution, before the project gets approved, they actually finance all of that project preparation work to get the projects ready for prime time. And so before you even take out a loan, you're getting all of that project preparation and consulting, and that's a huge benefit to the borrowing countries. And also reduce the cost of the project because you're not having to borrow for that money. For the private sector, these banks provide debt and equity financing for private projects. These are high minimum thresholds. So we're talking $10 to $30 million threshold for projects. So they're not financing micro projects. That is done through local banking sector. But what they do is that they do put capital into the local banking sector to fund some of those micro projects, so we can talk a little bit about that. But we're talking about, you know, major investment projects, again, overseas in the developing countries. These tools are open for all companies that are members of the bank. So it can be a US company. It just has to be in a borrowing country, a member country that's borrowing from the bank. They offer de-risking tools. Not every bank offers all of the same tools, but there are things such as investment credits, investment guarantees, insurance, and then also blended finance, public-private partnerships, that type of thing. Knowledge. These banks do a tremendous amount of free work that you can find online that you should definitely tap into if you haven't. Reports and data, research, policy recommendations, and a lot of convening, a lot of conferences, roundtables, and other things, bringing people together to talk about the solutions. And a lot of this work, like I said, is free. Most of these conferences are free. And it's a lot of free research and market data that your companies can use in your work, even if you decide not to work with the banks or for them. What are some things that the NDBs generally do not do? And again, this is general. Again, I'm just going to go back to my warning about oversimplification. They generally do not work in the defense sector, so they're not buying any defense products, weapons, munitions, that type of thing. They do not do projects in entertainment unless it's development related, such as like ecotourism. So they'll do some tourism, but they're not doing amusement parks and things like that. They're not you know, building stadiums and arenas, that type of thing, unless there's a direct development aspect to it. They do not act as rapid response to humanitarian or other crises. So these are not humanitarian organizations. They are banks. They do not have sort of rapid response people. They are not the ones coming in with, you know, diapers and baby powdered, you know, milk and other things. That is more like the UN. They may help gather and generate funding to support some of these efforts, but they are not rapid response organizations. They do not replace local capital markets. So the goal of these banks is not to replace commercial lending in country. It is to de-risk it. So they're not going to want to do smaller projects that you could go to a local bank on the market. They are there to de-risk those bigger ticket items and to bring investment to the country that might not otherwise come, and to co-invest, but they are not replacing local capital markets. They do not conduct bulk buys of supplies and services for development needs. This is the one of the biggest misconceptions that people have. They say, oh, I have this special water that contains vitamins and minerals. The bank will love it. They can buy it and give it to all the countries. That is not how the banks work. The World Bank and others have used things such as bank facilitated procurement to facilitate market coordination. For example, during COVID, where they will go out, look at the market where there's a limited selection of what a supply and it's universally needed. The bank would go out and help negotiate some of those contracts on behalf of the governments so that they could sort of really help surge the demand, but they're not necessarily buying it and distributing it. And so the bank, as a rule, the banks are not buying products and giving them to developing countries. Developing countries are borrowing money for projects, and products might come and product needs might come through a result of those projects, but the banks themselves are not buying supplies and services for development needs. They buy supply and services for their own needs, which we'll talk about, but not for development needs. And then the other things that the banks generally do not do is they do not do strategic partnerships without joint financing. The bank is not going to sign a strategic partnership with an organization unless that organization is basically co-financing. So when the bank says strategic partnership, it's with like the Gates Foundation, because the Gates Foundation is basically giving the bank, say, $10 million to help build wells, say, in East Africa. So if you approach the bank for a strategic partnership, they're basically looking at as a way to surge extra financing for certain things. They are not looking at it in terms of going in side by side on a project if you're not bringing in the money. So if you want to work with the bank on a project, you have to bid on it. Procurement is the way that they get partners. They do not just do strategic partnership agreements just to work side by side on projects. Key sectors that the bank work in. So we said they don't do defense, they don't do entertainment. What do they do? So infrastructure. This is everything, hard and soft infrastructure. So everything from customs and screening to building roads, building bridges, dams, and other things. Energy, this is across the board. Most of the banks are not heavy into fossil fuels. You know, you don't need a multilateral development bank to do oil and gas exploration. But some of them, for example, the World Bank will do some downstream things for oil and gas. The World Bank recently decided to start looking into working on nuclear, mostly from a technical assistance perspective, but they do all kinds of energy from power, electricity, other renewables, hydro, solar, wind, all kinds of energy. ICT, so everything from building subsea transmission cables, satellite connectivity, and then the digital overlay to other projects as well. Education is a big area, health is a huge area, agriculture, transportation, water, and sanitation. So a wide array of sectors and areas in which they work. So let's talk about the United States and the multilateral development banks. There are many, many, many multilateral development banks, but the US only belongs to 5 of them. So some of the other organizations that you've heard of, the Islamic Development Bank, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the European Investment Bank. Like I mentioned, there's several bilateral development banks. There are many, many, many development banks. The United States is a shareholder in 5. There's also a development bank that is just USA and Mexico. Again, a bilateral one. But in terms of the multilateral development banks, the US is only a shareholder in 5. And those 5 are the World Bank, which is headquartered in Washington, D.C., where I am right now. The African Development Bank, which is headquartered in Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire. The Asian Development Bank, headquartered in Manila, Philippines. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is in London, and the Inter-American Development Bank, which is in Washington, D.C. The U.S. is the largest shareholder at all these banks. We're tied for largest shareholder at the ADB with Japan. I believe at the World Bank, we have 15%, just to give you a sense. So when we say largest shareholder, we're the largest, but we're not the majority shareholder. So we have 15% of the World Bank, not 50%. And so, you know, we have sway, obviously, but we don't own the banks, and we don't necessarily drive what the banks do. So these are the 5 banks in which the U.S. is a shareholder, and these are the 5 banks at which we have 2-person commercial liaison teams that are here to help you. And so I'm going to just talk a little bit about some of the differences between these and some of the other banks. But there will be another time where we can really do deep dive into each of the banks and how they work. But I want to stress that, again, I've been doing a lot of big generalizations, but there are some key differences between the banks that I did want to highlight. So some of the broad differences, and again, some of many. One is regional coverage. You have the World Bank, which covers pretty much the entire world in terms of low and middle income countries. So we're only talking about low and middle income countries, but regional coverage, the World Bank, for example, has all low and middle income countries across the world for the most part. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development covers a lot of Southeastern Europe. So think of like the Balkans, some of those countries, the South Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Central Asia, the stands that aren't Afghanistan and Pakistan. But the EBRD also has started a long time ago working in North Africa. And now they're actually opening up a few offices in Sub-Saharan Africa. The Inter-American Development Bank does all of Latin America and the Caribbean. Again, the low and middle income countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. The African Development Bank does all 54 countries in Africa, North and Sub-Saharan Africa. The Asian Development Bank has all of East and South Asia, as well as Central Asia and the Caucasus. So there's areas, for example, like the Caucasus and Central Asia, which is actually one of my areas of specialization. I'm a Russia-Eurasia specialist, where 3 banks actually overlap. So places like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, you've got the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the Asian Development Bank all operating. The other thing that separates the banks is the difference in the amount of public versus private sector lending in the portfolio. So we'll talk about that a little bit in another slide. So some banks are very heavily focused on the public sector. And so basically, you know, the only way to work with those banks is to bid on public sector projects. They have very little private sector lending. There's at least one bank that is almost exclusively private sector lending. There's really not a lot of public sector work. So that difference in the portfolio, and then also as part of that, sub-institutions and sectors. So there are some banks like the World Bank, which is really the World Bank Group, that is actually 5 different institutions. And again, part of the reason that I don't want to go bank by bank in this presentation is that this is already a lot. and going bank by bank, is just a lot to take in, but we can do that in the future. That's partly why we want to do the poll, is we wanted to get a sense of what interest there is in looking at in other banks. So there's sub-institutions and sectors. In some cases, the public versus private sector lending are different institutions in the banks. The political risk insurance and other things are different institutions. There are different institutions based on whether the lending is concessional or not, whether you're talking about lending at low interest rates for low-income countries versus lending for middle-income countries. So lots of those types of things. And then the size of the portfolio, meaning just how much money they have to spend. The World Bank is bigger by at least double than the next biggest one, which is the Asian Development Bank, and so on and so forth. So they're very, so for example, the African Development Bank covers all of Africa, but the African Development Bank spends probably only a fifth of what the World Bank does in Africa, just to give you a sense. So the size of the portfolio really, really matters. And these banks can work together, and they often do work together and might co-finance a loan. And we can talk about that a little bit later. I'm going to push through it because I definitely want to leave time for questions. Again, I'm going to give you all these slides as poor as they are, and I will work on them in the future. These acronyms, some of them we talked about, like ADB, AFDB, they list many other development banks. This is just a sense of like the geographic coverage. So you will have this, so you don't have to stare at this for too long of the banks. And notice that the World Bank is in all of them. And then sovereign versus private lending. So you see IBRD and IDA, those are both part of the World Bank. And we'll talk about that if you take my World Bank 101 class. But for example, the ADB predominantly does the Asian Development Bank sovereign lending. They don't do a lot of private sector lending at the Asian Development Bank. But then you look at the EBRD, for example, and the EBRD, it primarily does non-sovereign. So they are the ones to go to if you're looking into Europe or North Africa, and you're really looking at private finance. So again, you'll have this, and we're also happy to talk about this later. But just want to give you a sense of how the banks can be different. So I've said all that. Why should you care? What does this mean for business, right? Like, I get it. Like, that was a lot of information, but what does this actually mean for me as a business? Danica, why are you wasting my time? Okay. I've got a couple slides. Again, complete overgeneralization, but just to give you a bit of a concept for where to find the opportunities at the banks. One way to think about it, and I have another slide that'll show you another way to think about it, is public sector, private sector, and corporate procurement. Public sector, the banks are, in the case of most of them, are loaning money to sovereign or sub-sovereign entities for development projects. And so there's money being lent to these projects, and there's opportunities that come from those projects. Two, private sector. There are tools for private sector financing in low and middle income countries that your companies can look at, various instruments. And then corporate procurement. This term might differ by bank, but a lot of them use this corporate procurement term. And there are two different areas under corporate procurement. Corporate procurement is where you're getting the check written to you directly by the bank. One, all of these banks need things for themselves. The World Bank alone, for example, we have, I think, 7 or 8 buildings here in DC, and then we have over 100 offices overseas. And so the World Bank itself is a procurement market. The bank needs chairs, and it needs IT services, and we have healthcare clinics for staff, construction of a new office, financial services, office supplies, real estate. So the banks themselves actually are a market for services. And they usually have some sort of portal separate from all of the other development stuff that is just opportunities for the bank. The other thing is, most often under corporate procurement, there's usually a consultant management system. Several of the banks operate their consultant management through corporate procurement as well, because they are paying for the consultants for a lot of the project preparation, and a lot of that happens before a country is lent money for a project. And so because of that, the country is not paying for it, the bank is paying for it. So most of the consulting opportunities are actually under corporate procurement, which is a completely different portal than some of the other opportunities. And it's important for you to know this, because this is going to affect how you strategize, and it's going to affect who you're working with. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So another way of presenting this is, here's what they do, and then what does this mean about what you can do? So for example, the banks finance public sector development projects. Therefore, you can bid on those bank finance procurement projects. You can chase the primes for subcontracts. So let's say you don't, many of these projects are done at an aggregate and you only, let's say, again, we use the example of you have this special water that's treated with vitamins and minerals that can help reduce, nourishment and nutrition and address nutrition concerns. The bank is probably not doing one project that's just buy 500,000 bottles of this special water. The project is going to be a bigger nutrition project that's going to aim at, let's say, enhancing nutrition, for 5 and 6 year olds in Chad, for example. Sometimes under the procurement plan, there might be a direct buy. And so you want to look to see if there is a direct buy, in which case, great, bid on it. But there might be instead, they might be calling on somebody to manage the whole project. And then that person will actually do the subcontracting. There are some companies that never ever bid on a bank finance government project. They just chase the projects and chase the primes. The awardees for most of these projects are put on most of the bank's websites. But also if you have people on the ground, you can snoop around and figure that out as well, or just know even ahead of time who's going to be bidding, and you can chase them for subcontracts. The other thing that you can do is just follow the demand signal in the sector and offer services. What do I mean by that? There are some companies, again, they don't even bother with bidding on a project or even chasing a prime. What they do is they look and say, World Bank Kenya, oh, there's a big project on hydropower. That means the Kenyan government is willing to borrow money and is spending money on hydropower. We offer some services regarding that. So let's go to Kenya and talk to them about hydropower. So you can also use the bank projects as a demand signal for where they are interested in certain services. And aside from whatever the World Bank or the African Development Bank or anybody else is doing, follow that market demand signal. So basically see these projects as trade leads. The banks hire consulting, advisory, and project preparation services. What can you do? You can bid on operational consulting and service contracts. These tend to be, go in and do a feasibility study on this road, do a survey. It can be monitoring and evaluation. All of this is under that. There are also short and extended term in-house consulting that many of these banks have, where you're not bidding on a contract related to a specific project, but the bank is basically hiring you as a consultant to itself because they don't want a staff position or something. So those are also short-term and extended-term consulting jobs. One of the mistakes that a lot of people make, for example, with the World Bank is everybody applies for staff jobs. Those are really hard to get. It's a lot easier usually to come in as a consultant, a short-term consultant or extended consultant, and then translate that later. But some people end up staying consultants for 10 years. So bidding on operational consulting or applying for actual consulting jobs where you're actually sitting and embedded in the bank. In the case of the World Bank, the US companies get 52% of the corporate procurement. So the vast majority of the consultants and a lot of these contracts are actually going to US companies. So just FYI. The MDBs do debt, equity, and finance and investment guarantees. What does that mean for you? It means if you have a project, you're building a factory to make that nutrition water, for example, you can apply for financing. You can also seek investment guarantees that you need to make an investment in the country, political risk insurance, other financial tools. Again, going back to corporate procurement, if you are looking at wanting to actually do something for the bank itself, like you want to be the bank's auditor, you want to do HR services, that type of thing. Corporate procurement for bank facilities at HQ and borrowing countries. Each bank has a minimum 50 offices. The African Development Bank is one of the smallest. It's got 54 members. So the African Development Bank has 54 offices. So each of these are procurement markets. You have the best shot at places where you have people. So the IDB and the World Bank, there's a lot of corporate procurement that the US wins because the headquarters is physically in the US. And so a lot of those contracts, they're all coming through headquarters. If you want to do, stuff with the African Development Bank, if you want to help build their offices around the world, then it's probably best if you have somebody, for example, in Cote d'Ivoire or nearby, that can meet and talk with them. So for corporate procurement, you can bid on contracts to supply the banks themselves with everything from goods and services, IT, construction, etc. The other thing, the banks develop knowledge reports, publications, conferences. They have all of these sector specialists. Again, even if you don't bid on anything, you should consider meeting with bank experts to build awareness of innovations and solutions in your sector, to influence project preparation, influence the standards by which the project is going to be written, attend conferences to network, also to network with borrowing country governments. So again, just a way to think about what you can do based on what the banks do. So you're getting all this information. What do you do next, right? Like, how do you even conceptualize this? So I wanted to provide a little bit of a roadmap. Again, I will get better at this and get better at thinking through this. So the infographic, I'll get a better infographic. But here are some questions to ask yourself and to ask your company. First of all, what is it that you want to do? Are you looking to bid on a project? Are you looking for financing for an investment? Or do you want to be a consultant? What actually do you want to do? How do you want to attack this? What part of the bank or banks or what parts do you want to be involved in? Another question to ask. Do you only want to do work that is directly paid for by the bank, or are you willing to look into bank finance, foreign government procurement? That is probably the biggest thing. If you do not want to do foreign procurement, foreign government procurement, then you are really restricted to things that are only financed by the bank, which means you're looking at the corporate procurement and you're looking at the consulting. But if you're willing, the big money is in actually the foreign government procurement. So for example, in the case of the World Bank, all corporate procurement total last year was $2 billion. That includes everything from consultants to buying a new headquarters in Philippines or whatever. But the actual lending by the bank for the private and the public, most of it going to public, was like $58 billion. So just to give you a sense of magnitude, the corporate stuff is much smaller, but though it's also smaller. So if you're like a small and medium-sized enterprise and you're looking for like the $200,000 and $300,000 contracts, that's going to be more in the corporate. You need to think about what sectors you have experience in. And then another important thing is to think about where you have resources, experience, language skills, etc. People come into me all the time. Where should I work with the bank? I don't know. I can't answer that. I shouldn't answer that. If you know that you got nobody that has French language skill, then don't look at anything in a French language speaking country, for example. So look at where you have resources. Do you already have a headquarters in Nairobi? Then really think about East Africa. So look at where you have resources, experience, language skills, etc. And again, you'll have these, so you'll be able to keep these notes. Building an MDB strategy, research. You need to do your homework. You cannot get over this. My team does not have the ability to do all of this research for you. We can guide you, but you're going to have to do a lot of research. You're going to have to look at country strategies. Every bank that operates in a country, there's going to be a country strategy, and it's all going to be online. All the pipeline projects are going to be online. There are project search websites. Each bank is going to have some sort of project search. In the case of the World Bank, it's simple. Projects.worldbank.org is for the what we call operational, so the foreign government procurement. And then if you Google, like, for example, World Bank corporate procurement, then they've got a website that has, a thing where you can search what they have available. So each of these banks is going to have some sort of project search website, and it might be more than one. Again, depending on what you want to do. There are going to be all kinds of bank reports and publications. So for example, if you're going to go in and talk to the bank about a water, you're going to want to make sure that you've researched, Inter-American Development Bank and water, and see what they've already said about it. Webinars and training events, things like this and other things that the banks are doing. You can sign up for alerts on most of their websites. There's local offices. So if you have offices in country, you can meet with local offices. There's HQ offices and all kinds of conferences. Annual meetings, World Bank annual meetings are coming up October 13th through 16th. So annual meetings, and that's going to be in DC, are another way to interact with the banks. The Asian Development Bank, their business opportunities fair is next week, I believe, or later this week. I think it's next week. So there are all kinds of opportunities. These are Danica's tips and warnings. For those of you who are my age, remember reading Rainbow, but you don't have to take my word for it. Again, it's official, unofficial. So this is unofficial in the sense that these are not things that the banks are going to necessarily endorse me saying to you, but these are based on my experience and that of my team. Take it or leave it. You don't have to believe me, but these are the kinds of things that we will tell you and work with you through if you come and talk to us. One, understanding the decision maker for what you want and strategizing accordingly. if you are looking at public procurement, recognize that it's going to be the foreign governments that choose the short list and choose ultimately who are going to get the contract, not the bank. If it's corporate procurement, it's going to be the bank. That makes a big difference in who you talk to. Understand that most of the people you need to talk to are probably going to be overseas, even in the case of the World Bank and IDB, which are located in DC. The staff are all over the place. So just coming to DC is not going to solve the problem. You're going to have to end up talking to people overseas, if not physically, at least virtually, but just keep being aware of that. Again, you all probably know that already. Unless they're hosting a special session, a lot of banks aren't great at doing individual surprise company meetings. So you really need to think through, if you're going to approach somebody, what you want to talk to them about and why. Be prepared to be frustrated. They are dealing with companies from every member country, and many of them are not necessarily set up to do private sector outreach. So, beware that there might be some frustration. This is another key one. Unless you are selling chairs or something to the bank itself, do not make a sales pitch. The bank, again, are generally not the ones buying the services. And even if they are, you still have to bid through corporate procurement. And so just making a sales pitch and giving your sheet of what you do is not going to cut it. At a certain point, you're going to have to bid on projects, and you're bidding against the rest of the world. And in most cases, you're going to be bidding on foreign government procurements. The banks do a lot more in-house than most bilateral assistance agencies. USAID, for example, contracts out everything. That is not the case with the World Bank and others. They do most of this in-house. They do their own conferences. They run most of their own programming. If they need services, that's what they request under corporate procurement. So just an FYI. Sole sourcing and non-solicited proposals. They will say that they have a process for non-solicited proposals. The fact of the matter is they generally don't do that. I say just don't ask. If you do ask, just beware that it's probably not going to go anywhere. Because again, they are looking at stuff from countries from all over the world, and they are really wary about being seen as giving preferential treatment. And so they are not generally going to do a lot of sole sourcing. They can do sole sourcing for very small amounts. So for example, for corporate procurement, if they just need like a small survey or something they need done, they can do stuff like, $50,000 or less. But if you're talking about, $1 million project, it's probably not going to happen in terms of sole sourcing. I mentioned this before, do not propose strategic partnerships with the banks unless you are like a foundation and are prepared to be giving equal amount of money. Minimums and thresholds. Several of the banks will not let, they have a different model than AID. The World Bank, for example, the World Bank cannot be your primary source of income. So I know that I've met companies where 80% of their revenue was from AID projects. It's not going to happen with these banks. You can only bid on projects that are a certain threshold above the minimum of what your company brings in. So if your company brings in $1 million, like say last year, then you cannot bid on a project for $800,000 because they do not want to be your sole source. Now you can work across banks. So you can work across banks, but no one bank wants to be the reason for your company's existence. They do not want to create an economy based on their work. And so that is something that you're going to run into. The banks expect you to have done your homework. When you meet with them, they expect you to have done some of your research. So remember, the internet is your friend. And again, they're not there to implement the policy of any one government. So just be careful in terms of how you frame your discussions. So like if you frame your advantage as, we, are really big in an area that the U.S. prioritizes with XYZ, just remember the banks are covering every country. And I will speed up through the last few. I'm almost done in terms of some resources. I hope I haven't been boring. If I have, I apologize. I'll buy you a cup of coffee or make you a cup of coffee if you come and see me. A bank strategy case study. So let's say you came to me and said, Danica, okay, we're interested in bidding on a public sector project. We went online to the IDB, and it turns out the IDB is they have a project where they are looking at building a road, in Chile. Well, not Chile wouldn't be a good example, but in Panama, and we want to bid on that project. One of the things that you might want to start doing is watching videos and other things that you can find on the procurement process that the banks use. Even though the governments themselves are making the decisions, they are using the bank's procurement process. Most of the banks, their public sector procurement processes are very similar. So once you master one, you usually won't have any trouble with the others. But there are training videos and things out there. These are the the kinds of things that my team, we can help push you towards things, and we can also help you understand where we might be doing our own training and webinars. You can search for projects on websites and start doing that. This is what I call intern homework. Get an intern or somebody. Read any knowledge projects on the sector. So read any publications and things, skim that the banks have done so you get a sense of what they're looking for. You need to decide on your resource allocation for bidding. This is important. As you can imagine, if you've never bid on an MDB project before, it can be a lot. And so you're going to have to put out a certain amount of resources in order to do this. You can either do it in-house, meaning you can take 1 or 2 employees, send them through a lot of training, get them to master it over time, and let them be your MDB experts, or you can hire a company to do it. We have a list of some companies that we know of. There are companies who specialize in helping companies bid on MDB projects and even get MDB financing, where basically you pay them, they will look at all of the projects that every MDB does. They will help you decide which bank you should work on. They will tell you which projects you should bid on. They will give you a strategy for how to bid on them. They will do the work in walking you in to talk to people at the bank, to talking to people overseas, and they will put together your bidding documents. But you have to pay them, or you do all that in-house. But just saying that's a possibility, just something to think about. Consider attending bank events in country and in the USA. Meet with myself or somebody else on our commercial liaison teams. Find local partners if needed. The Commerce Department can help with that. We have programs where we can help you find local partners and help you vet local partners as well. And again, that's something that we can talk about when we have engagement with you. You can attend early market engagements. The World Bank is now doing early market engagements, and others. The governments will often do a webinar or something, or inquire with bank project contacts that are listed on the websites to understand specifics. Get in front of the borrowing government, and then apply for a DOC advocacy. So this is, again, just if you're looking at, say, the public sector aspect. So USG and other resources, my team is available. We do counseling. Basically, a lot of what I told you here is what we can work with you on an individual basis in terms of what you're looking at. Market intelligence, help you find information about the market if you need, networking, advocacy, which we'll talk about in a second, and then troubleshooting. The Advocacy Center, Hiro is executive director. You just heard from him. The Advocacy Center helps U.S. companies bid on foreign government procurement. So if you decide to bid on that road project in Panama, we can actually help. We basically take all of the aspects of the U.S. interagency, and we literally help, whether it's writing a letter, getting a phone call from an official. We help sell your service to that foreign government to try to get you a win. And so I'm not going to go through all this because we're short on time, but this will be available, and we can actually do a separate session just on advocacy if you want to learn more on that. And that's done by our colleagues at the Advocacy Center. So again, you'll get this. The threshold, in order to be approved for advocacy, we prefer U.S. interests with at least a U.S. content of 50%. We can make exceptions to that if there is through a national interest determination. It's got to be a foreign public tender, which all of the bank finance things through a foreign government are. So the public sector opportunities are. There needs to be foreign competition. We don't just promote, again, a sole source project because we don't want to force something down a government's throat that they're not actively looking at. And the point of influence is a foreign official. This is a little bit about the process of what we do for advocacy. This is our team. Michael Staunton, who works with me at the World Bank, is online. A couple of other of our team members might be online. And again, I will provide this to you. So thank you. I know that was a lot. I'm sorry. I hope that everybody hasn't peeled off. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Danica, for your plethora of information, for your time. We're just going to ask a short open-ended poll to guide further sessions. As you mentioned, this is part one of a longer series. So hopefully this poll will help us to guide the topics that we want to be covering in the future, and then we'll move to Q&A. So I'll just keep the poll open while we start addressing some questions that we have in the chat box. So the first question from Rebecca Alberg: how are MDBs working with civil society organizations? Are there any examples of good practices that could be shared?
Yeah, so all of the MDBs have some sort of civil society outreach. And actually, they actually have certified civil society organizations that actually are invited, for example, to come to the annual meetings and other things. We take those consultations very seriously. So, for example, our U.S. executive director to the World Bank and the other executive directors meet with civil society all the time. So civil society organizations actually have a direct role. Civil society organizations are consulted when we're looking at building the projects. And so that's one of the things that they give us insight as to what we should be asking. And so very often before a project comes to the board, there will be civil society review. And for example, our executive director or others will say, well, hey, we met with, the International Institute of, Green Building, and they are very concerned about XYZ. What are you doing to mitigate that? So civil society plays a huge role in that in terms of the projects. And then we have civil society roundtables, for example, during the annual and spring meetings. That's part of the point of the annual and spring meetings is that civil society can weigh in. Hope that that helped.
Okay, thank you so much. The next question is from Eduardo Segatore. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Is there a list of DC area companies that partner with Inter-American Development Banks to advance American business in Latin America and the Caribbean? I'd like to understand who these companies are. Thank you.
That's a great question. So when we do, if you want an IDB session, let me know. We have two great people at the IDB. The IDB actually has something that none of the other MDBs have, in that they have something called IDB Connect. They have an app. The IDB has an app where suppliers can connect to find each other to work on projects. How cool is that? I wish the World Bank would do that. So I believe it's IDB Connect. And then they also have something called Bid for the Americas, which is specifically also supposed to help. They wanted to do something literally targeted toward U.S. companies to help U.S. companies to connect. So IDB Connect and Bid for the Americas, if you look those up, are examples where the IDB is actually very forward thinking in a way that like the World Bank has nothing like that, where you can connect. So no, I don't have a list, but the IDB actually does have resources for connecting to other companies that are looking to bid.
As a follow-up of that question by Ken Rogers, is there a good way for U.S. companies to get a flow of leads, as in concrete business opportunities by sector that we can either bid on or assist U.S. solution providers to get the work that MBD finances?
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, every MDB has one or two project websites. I saw my colleague Michael put the World Bank one up. So first of all, it depends again on what you want to do. Do you want to do the consulting side, or do you want to bid directly on the foreign government procurement? Because sometimes in the case of the World Bank, there's two different sites you need to go to. So in the case of the World Bank, there are the projects, the full big projects that are government financed, and those are projects.worldbank.org. But then there's also consulting opportunities through the corporate procurement website, even for these future government projects. And then there's also the job opportunities as well that you can find on LinkedIn and other places. So you can, each individual bank will have all of these opportunities. We'll have one or two websites that have it on there, or you can go to sort of consolidated areas. So you can pay for like DevX. I believe Development Aid also does a good job of consolidating this for all of the MDBs. There used to be the UN Business Development Portal. They actually retired recently, which was a shame. But there are, like I said, there's DevX and some others that actually you can basically put in. And on the World Bank site, for example, and most of these sites for all the banks, you can actually sign up for alerts and get alerted anytime something happens in a specific sector or a specific country. And many of those alerts will also alert you if there's a publication that's coming out as well. So I, for example, signed up for alerts on the procurement website, and I get like, oh, every publication that comes out about, say, Africa or about energy. So you can sign up for alerts, and you can do that for each of the banks individually. If you don't want to have to do that for each individual bank, then I would suggest you look at one of these services that consolidates. And I'm sure many of you, like I said, know a lot of those, like DevX and Development Aid.
Okay, thank you. The next question, are MBDs following FPIC free, prior, and informed consent when working in areas where Indigenous people live, recognizing that FPIC is part of the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, yet many countries may not be following these practices?
The World Bank is a UN, it's a UN adjacent institution, Bretton Woods institution. The World Bank and all these MDBs all follow UN standards.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Scott Kleinberg. Will the bank fund project preparation funding for private sector investment, i.e. solar project? And to add, are there any other MBDs that would? Focuses on Africa.
No, they're not going to fund project preparation for a solar project. And if they do, they might do it locally for maybe a local company, but they're not going to fund the private sector project preparation.
Okay,
In
thank
terms
you.
of other MDBs, I don't know. I'm only familiar with the 5 that we work with, but if you want like a feasibility study done on something, that's something that, like, for example, you might look at U.S. Trade Development Agency. They will fund a feasibility study, give you a for a project if they think a U.S. company would be interested in it. So U.S. Trade Development Agency is one to look at for that. And the IFC might be, for example, the World Bank might do help with some of the legwork, but generally no, not for a solo project unless we're talking, when you say solo project, again, the MDBs are not looking into micro projects. They are looking to de-risk bigger projects. So like minimum $10 to $30 million threshold type projects. If it's a smaller project, that's something that you have to go on the local capital market to fund. But yeah, project preparation is a big thing, I think, in general, that I think there's a lack of funding for. It's a great question, but generally probably not for what you're looking for.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Richard America. How can a small US-based economic development consulting firm submit a concept paper or unsolicited pre-proposal to a senior decision maker at World Bank and African Development Bank for country-specific community-level SME projects in Africa?
As I mentioned before, the banks really don't do that.
Okay.
They just don't. Like you don't. If you're going after corporate procurement, for example, which, to do, like, say, you're going to bid to do feasibility studies, that type of thing, the corporate procurement decisions are made, for example, here in DC, based on the quality of your bid. They don't want a concept note beforehand, and they don't partner. Again, so even if you gave them a concept note, they can't do anything about it unless there is a project that they have that they need you to bid on. So they are not going to generate a project that is most of the bank, what the work the bank is doing is preparing projects that governments want to finance. So again, the governments are the ultimate customers for most of the bank. So they are looking for people to help them with preparation for their projects. They're not looking for you to bring a project for a government to do. Does that make sense? And because they're not like a bilateral assistance agency, they can't just decide, well, we think this project is great and we're going to take it to the government. If a government's going into debt, then they're going to be very careful with what they are talking to with the governments about, because they don't want to be seen as putting governments in a debt trap. So they're not going to go to a government and say, you really need to do this and you need to borrow money to do it. For the private sector projects, again, these are major development projects that they are looking to de-risk. So you can go to, so the decision makers, again, are really going to be the people that are looking at the bids. And so you cannot basically push a project on the bank that the bank doesn't want to do. It's the governments that are asking the banks to do projects that they want to do. And then the bank is doing the project preparation work basically on behalf of the government. They are not looking for your ideas, if that makes any sense. I know it sounds harsh to say. I'm just trying to save you time. It's a very different model than, say, USAID or other things. They do not have money lying around to just say, oh, this looks good, we'll have you do it. It just doesn't work like that. It's a completely different model. So basically, you have to bid on projects, whether it's consulting or a government finance project. But there are lots of opportunities. Like I was on the site the other day, and like there's like if you do, for example, monitoring evaluation, things like that, there's tons of that kind of stuff. Feasibility studies, surveys, that type of thing. But no, you really can't go to them with your own idea and say, do this. It's just not going to work. However, if you're part of their ecosystem, if you're going to conferences and other things, you never know. There might be money left over in a trust fund or something like that. And they might be able to pay you, $40,000 to help them with a conference on such and such. That's stuff that it takes having a very deep relationship with them to do. With somebody on the project level, it's not something where you're going to send something in blind. If you're sending something in blind, it's a no. You really have to develop those relationships first.
Okay, thank you so much. And as a follow-up from Scott Kleinberg, he's mentioning regarding the question of the project preparation funding, he said this would be a large generation project. So I'm not sure if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, I would talk to if it's power gen, for example, like I would talk to like the IFC or other people about it to see if it's something that they'd be interested in. Can't hurt. It in general for most of first of all, where the project is matters. Most of the project generation for the private sector projects, they're looking for people to come to them with the project. They don't generate the project, and they're not trying to fund generation of the projects. That's not their model. They're trying to de-risk things that already are in train. So they are trying to de-risk projects that are already in train and just need that extra 10%, that type of thing. They are generally not generating projects. Sometimes they advertise projects that they think would be good for the private sector. So I just don't know that's what they generally do. However, that kind of business development is done directly on the ground in the case of the World Bank and in the case of the Asian Development Bank as well. And so you would need to approach the local office of whatever country you're looking at. So if let's say it's in Panama, then you'd have to talk to the IFC people on the ground in Panama and see if it's something that they'd be interested in. And and I would encourage you to talk to them because they would know what other players might be around and might want to keep an eye on it. And they definitely will know other people that might be interested and might have some ideas.
Okay, thank you so much. The next question is anonymous. What are your recommendations for firms that are new to NBDs, NDBs, to help them successfully compete with entrenched incumbents and established NDBs implementing partners?
Yeah, so I would go back to some of those questions that I had in that slide. Where are you strong? So for example, where are you the most competitive? Where do you have an office possibly overseas, or where do you have local partners? So start with your strengths. Do not try to compete in areas that you haven't competed in before. So if you have a lot of work doing business in Kenya, then start with Kenya, for example. So that would be my biggest piece of advice, is to start where you already have strengths. And again, to build relationships. These are not short-term pivots. These are medium to long-term. So building the relationships is crucial, and making sure that you're part of the ecosystem, and meeting people. So much happens when people just meet people in person. There's no substitute for that. And it's an investment. I'm not saying it's not. I'm not saying any of this is easy, but that's how you do it. But again, start, building relationships, and then also, and building relationships without necessarily handing people a specification sheet, right? Like really networking with people on knowledge sharing, and then specifically starting in countries and sectors where you have the most, where you have the most work on the ground. Unless you're doing just like, say, monitoring, evaluation, and things, in which case they want to see that level of experience. And I would also start for the corporate procurement. For those of you who had a lot of revenue from AID, I would start bidding on the corporate procurement stuff now, while your revenue for the last, I forgot exactly when, sort of what year they're looking at as your baseline for your revenue, but you want to start now, sooner rather than later, while you actually qualify, based on your revenue for the last couple of years. But that would be my suggestion.
Okay, thank you. And our final question by Genevieve Atwood. How do you handle an advocacy situation when multiple US companies are bidding on a foreign tender?
Sure. So first of all, it depends on whether the other US companies have approached us. So we only advocate for the companies that have approached us. If it's multiple US companies and they all qualify, then we will advocate on behalf of all of the companies, and we will name the companies. So we don't pick the winner, but we will advocate on behalf of all the US companies.
Okay, that was our final question. Thank you so much, Danica.
Thank you so much, Danica.
So I hope this was a good, I hope it didn't seem too generic. I hope that it really actually had enough specificity to be helpful. I just thought it would be good to do a bigger overview before we delve into any individual bank. So please, your feedback would really be very helpful. This is the first time I've done this sort of really understanding the MDBs. So if you hated it, that's fine. I can take it. I won't do it again. You all will be the guinea pigs. But if you thought this was helpful, let me know, and I really will work to make the presentation better. And then, like I said, there's presentations we can do for each bank, and then there's presentations we can do sub-presentations. In other words, you can do World Bank 101, but then also World Bank corporate procurement versus World Bank project procurement. Like, so there's a lot that can be done here. And we're here to work with you, but the more background that you have, the easier it is for us to work with you. It's not really helpful to either of us when people come and just say, tell me what to do with the World Bank. So we really hope that, and appreciate you taking the time to sit in on the webinar and learn, because some people don't want to do that step. They just want to be sort of hand-fed, and really appreciate you taking the time to listen. Thank you so much. And for the excellent questions.
Thank you a lot, Danica, and also thank you for sticking around past time to answer the question. This has been very helpful. We're going to gather the response we had from the surveys, and then inform you about what resonated with the listeners and what we should be looking into next.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you all. It was great working with you. And by the way, I believe the Society for International Development, the World Bank does have a board member. I think the person just left, but just great work for what the Society of International Development does, and for JESCA Corporation. Thank you all for approaching me, and it's been great working with you.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
doing that for us. That was very, very an excellent presentation. And I'm sure you'll have to work with us in the future with all the answers, the questions that we have. So thank you in advance.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.